The antebellum period in the southern United States, from the late 18th century until the Civil War in 1861, was a time marked by deep societal contradictions, particularly around the institution of slavery. This period saw the entrenchment of the South's agrarian economy, heavily reliant on slave labor, which not only shaped the region's social, political, and economic structures but also informed its moral and cultural landscape. Central to this oppressive system was the dynamic of power between enslavers and the enslaved, a relationship based on the absolute dominance of white masters and the subjugation of black people. Embedded within this system was the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, who were doubly burdened by their race and gender. The institution of slavery allowed white men, both the planter elite and those of lower status, to wield unchecked power over black women, with sexual abuse becoming a normalized facet of life on plantations and in households across the South. To understand the full extent of this exploitation, it is important to examine the origins of the power structures that enabled such abuse. The transatlantic slave trade laid the foundation for the institution of slavery in the New World, but it was in the American South where the system would evolve into a uniquely brutal form of exploitation. In the early years of colonization, European settlers rationalized the enslavement of African people as a necessary evil for the development of their economic interests, particularly in the cultivation of cash crops like tobacco, rice, and later cotton. As slavery became more entrenched in Southern society, racialized ideologies emerged to justify and perpetuate the institution, presenting African people as inherently inferior, subhuman, and suited only for servitude. The consolidation of these racial ideologies created a social order that placed white people, particularly white men, at the top of the hierarchy, with absolute authority over the lives of the enslaved. This power dynamic was reinforced not only through legal frameworks, but also through cultural norms that positioned the white man as the moral and intellectual superior to all others. For enslaved people, particularly women, this meant living in a constant state of vulnerability, with no legal or social recourse against the abuses they suffered. The power dynamics that defined a relationship between masters and slaves were rooted in violence and coercion. The very nature of slavery was violent, as it involved the forced labor and physical subjugation of individuals who had been torn from their homelands and families. Enslavers used various forms of violence to maintain control over their slaves, including physical punishment, psychological manipulation, and the constant threat of separation from loved ones. This violence was not limited to men. Women were subjected to the same brutal treatment, often with the added dimension of sexual exploitation. Sexual violence against enslaved women was a pervasive aspect of life in the antebellum South. This exploitation was not merely the result of individual depravity or isolated incidents, but was systemic and institutionalized within the broader framework of slavery. The legal system offered no protection for enslaved women, as they were considered property, not people. Enslavers had the legal right to do with their slaves as they wished, including subjecting them to sexual violence. In fact, the rape of enslaved women by white men was so common that it became a widely accepted, though seldom publicly acknowledged, part of plantation life. One of the most horrifying aspects of this system was the way in which it dehumanized and commodified enslaved women's bodies. Women were not only seen as laborers but also as breeders, whose reproductive capabilities were exploited for economic gain. The children born of these unions, whether consensual or not, were considered the property of the mother's owner and were often sold or used as laborers. This practice further reinforced the power dynamic between white men and enslaved women, as it allowed white men to exploit both the labor and the reproductive capacities of black women for their own benefit. In addition to the economic motivations behind the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, there were also deeply ingrained cultural and psychological factors at play. The antebellum South was a patriarchal society in which white men held virtually all of the power. This power extended not only over enslaved people, but also over white women, who were expected to adhere to strict codes of purity and chastity. For many white men, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women served as an outlet for desires that could not be fulfilled within the constraints of their own social norms. Enslaved women were viewed as sexually available and morally corrupt, a stark contrast to the ideals of white womanhood, and this perception made them easy targets for abuse. The power dynamic between white men and enslaved women was further complicated by the fact that many enslaved women were forced into domestic roles within their masters' households. These women often worked closely with their masters and were subject to their whims and desires in ways that field slaves were not. The proximity of enslaved women to white men in the household setting made them even more vulnerable to sexual exploitation, as they were constantly under the watchful eye of their owners. The sexual abuse of enslaved women was not only a means of asserting power and control over them, but also served as a way for white men to reinforce their dominance over the entire slave population. By sexually exploiting enslaved women, white men were able to humiliate and degrade both the women and the men who were powerless to protect them. This created a culture of fear and submission among the enslaved, as they were constantly reminded of their helplessness in the face of their master's authority. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women also had profound psychological effects on both the women themselves and the larger enslaved community. For the women who were subjected to sexual violence, the experience was one of profound trauma, compounded by the knowledge that they had no recourse or protection. The children born of these unions were often a source of shame and pain for the mothers, who knew that their children would be raised as slaves, often by the very men who had raped them. For the enslaved men, the sexual abuse of their wives, daughters, and sisters was a constant reminder of their own powerlessness and the complete control that white men had over their lives. As a result of these power dynamics, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women became a central feature of the institution of slavery in the antebellum South. It was not an aberration or a side effect of the system, but an integral part of the way in which slavery functioned. The dehumanization of black women, their reduction to mere property, and the exploitation of their bodies for both labor and sexual purposes were all essential components of the slave system. The commodification of enslaved women's bodies extended beyond the individual plantation. Slave auctions were notorious for the way in which women were displayed and examined, their physical attributes scrutinized not only for their potential as laborers, but also for their sexual attractiveness and reproductive capabilities. Enslaved women were often stripped naked and subjected to the leering eyes and probing hands of potential buyers, who assessed their value based on their ability to bear children as well as their capacity for hard labor. This public display of women's bodies reinforced the power dynamics at play, as it demonstrated the complete lack of agency and autonomy that enslaved women had over their own lives. The intersection of race, gender, and power in the antebellum South created a unique environment in which the sexual exploitation of enslaved women was not only tolerated but actively encouraged by the structures of power. The legal system, the economic incentives, and the cultural norms all worked together to create a system in which white men had unchecked power over the bodies and lives of black women. This power dynamic was not only a reflection of the broader system of slavery, but also a crucial mechanism through which that system was maintained. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women in the antebellum South had long-lasting effects on both the women themselves and their descendants. The trauma of sexual violence, the forced separation of families, and the ongoing dehumanization of black women all contributed to a legacy of pain and suffering that continued long after slavery was officially abolished. The children born of these unions were often subjected to the same brutal treatment as their mothers, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation and abuse that would last for generations. Examining the power dynamics and sexual exploitation of slaves in the antebellum South, it is important to recognize the ways in which these practices were not simply the result of individual depravity, but were instead deeply embedded in the structures of power that defined Southern society. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women was a tool of domination, used by white men to assert their authority and reinforce the racial and gender hierarchies that underpin the institution of slavery.